And so I'm delighted to invite Dr. Paul QUIRK. Paul is the Phil Lynch Chair in US Politics and Representation at UBC. He earned his PhD in political science at Harvard University and has published widely on the presidency, Congress, public opinion, and policy. And Paul will consider today pathological politics, Trump pandemic, and the 2020 US elections. And Paul, I invite you to take over the screen.
Okay, are we ready? Well, thank you all for joining us. I hope everyone is getting along okay, bearing up under the strain of the social distancing and the like. I have a new haircut, which was administered to me by my wife, and I was quite satisfied with her achievement in that respect. I've tried her out as a personal trainer, but it turns out she's a bit too much of a hardliner in that capacity. So the topics that I'm going to, let's see, I need to go to the PowerPoint. This looks like something got out of order. The topics that we'll be talking about today are three aspects of the relations between politics and the pandemic. The first is the politics of the US response to the coronavirus. The second is the likely effects of that on the politics of the election, that is the competition between Democrats and Republicans, Biden and Trump. And then the third is the problem of conducting the election at all, or how it will be conducted in the circumstances of the pandemic. I want to give a little bit of background about my interests. Aideen has described my interests in general. This is a book in which I have a chapter. You'll see my name down at the very bottom right, which was about the 2016 elections. And my chapter in that book is this one, the presidency, Donald Trump, and the question of fitness. So the presidency and Trump are something that I follow quite closely. Incidentally, I'll be writing a similar chapter in a similar book about the 2020 elections. So I'm following these developments rather closely. I'm certainly not an expert on virology or epidemics or the like. A bit of a kind of a warning is that it would be possible to see, or for some people to see, some of my remarks about Trump and about the Republicans as being motivated by a partisan attitude, hostility to Republicans, or a preference for Democrats. And what I want to point out is that it's that I've been a generally non-partisan analyst as much as I can through my entire career. In recent years, however, the Republican Party has developed positions that are quite extreme and tactics that are much more confrontational and less cooperative, and caused a good deal of difficulty in the American political system. This quote that I have up on the screen is showing this goes back a ways. This is from an article by two people who were themselves historically very nonpartisan analysts, but they concluded by 2011 that the Republican Party has become an insurgent outlier in American politics, is ideologically extreme, scornful of compromise, and so forth. They basically at that point gave up trying to do commentary that was even-handed, saying a positive thing about Republicans for every positive thing that they said about Democrats, and so forth. And during the Trump administration, this view that the Republicans have become have kind of deviated substantially from the traditions of the American political system has become common, so that now there are quite a large number of formerly very prominent Republican commentators, still conservative commentators, who take the same view. So this is from this is a recent tweet by this columnist for the Washington Post. She writes the right turn column for the Washington Post, signaling that it's a conservative column. She's been writing that for quite a long time now. And she's one of many voices in the, among conservatives and former Republicans who are deeply alarmed about the state of the Republican Party. So my long-term attitude and my general attitude is to try to be non-partisan and certainly non-ideological in commentary. But the Republican Party is not in its normal state of performance. Those are our topics again. So we're going to talk about the response to the coronavirus. And the first thing I want to point out is, as many of you are aware, the United States has not done well in combating the coronavirus. This is a bit of data to show how the United States compares to other countries. Now, this is raw data. That is, it's not adjusting for the size of the country. And the United States is a large country, but as you can see, and these are deaths since the appearance of the first 100 cases in each country. You probably can't read very well the countries at the bottom, but basically all the other countries in the world are down at the bottom, with Spain being the one that sticks up a bit. So what it shows is that the United States has now had really the more by far than any other country. Now this next slide is important to look at for the purpose of putting that in perspective. And the point that it shows is that now, as up till now, in per capita terms, the United States is actually not an outlier. It's kind of down grouped among quite a few other countries. There are some tiny countries that are above it, but basically Spain is a little above it. But the United States is not extremely unusual. I think a very important point to keep in mind here is that the United States is a very large country, geographically spread out, and the pandemic began relatively late and hasn't reached many of the places in the United States yet. So in a sense, the story where you control for population or adjust for population, like in this chart, could be a little bit misleading. And it may well be that the United States will end up with very poor performance, even in per capita terms, even despite starting late. Now, why did this happen? The first thing to notice is that, the first thing to be aware of is that the administration the Trump administration, led by President Trump, ignored the warnings about the approach of the pandemic from late December through early January and February. There have been a number of very substantial revelations of documents and reports from inside the administration, pointing out that the US government had very substantial warnings, very direct and pointed warnings that the United States was under threat of an extremely serious pandemic attack throughout January and February. Recently, there was a memo by President Trump's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, that is a high White House official who you would have heard of in connection with trade, warning that the pandemic was going to be extremely serious, and this was in February. And it's also now been revealed that the so-called President's Daily Briefing, this is the briefing that he receives if he bothers to look at it, from the intelligence community, has been warning in very stark, dramatic terms about the development of this pandemic from throughout January and February. President Trump has ignored it and denied it throughout this period. So the failures of the administration have had several aspects. One is simply the president's rhetoric. He's compared the pandemic to the flu, said it was like the flu. He said that it was under control. We had it under control. Famously, he pointed out after the cases began to be identified that the United States had 15 cases. He predicted that those would quickly disappear. The federal government during this period failed to prepare for testing or tracing contacts or quarantining, failed to prepare for getting personal protective equipment available and ventilators and other supplies. And the president has refused to invoke the Defense Production Act so that the federal government could take over the orders to manufacture and distribute these goods. Furthermore, the president has discouraged lockdowns on the part of the states. The states are the ones really responsible for doing this. Now, you're all probably familiar with just about everything I've said. I would just want to comment that it's really quite interesting to think about why he has done these things. The puzzle about this is that if you look at the circumstances that he was being told that he faced by very authoritative sources, the only fair conclusion from that information that he had was that the United States was facing a disaster and that it would come quickly. That is, this is hard to interpret his behavior in terms of some priorities that he had, where the long-term harm from ignoring the virus would be less important to him than some short-term goals that he had. So it's a bit of a puzzle why he did this. Some have pointed to his being concerned about harming trade relationships with China. The main story seems to be that he was persuaded by a really delusional belief that the coronavirus pandemic was a so-called democratic hoax. That is, he believed that fears of the pandemic would be harmful to him politically. People would think he's not doing well, and that it was Democrats and their allies in the media who were overhyping the virus in order to make it, in order to increase that harm from people's fears. He had some advisors who made that argument. This next point to make, though, is that still the evidence that he had would have been overwhelming to any kind of ordinary or normal executive. And I think that there's getting to be a fair amount of commentary among some journalists and a lot of other commentators to the effect that some variety of mental illness and possibly dementia are factors in how he has responded. On the mental illness would be delusion and narcissism and the fantastical beliefs that are connected with that. Some journalists have started to point out issues about apparent problems of memory, balance, and his standing and walking, how difficulty finding words, somewhat slurred speech. This is maybe not dramatic yet, but there are some who are arguing that it's becoming more serious. Now, how has this affected the rest of the government? Republican governors have resisted the lockdown to a considerable extent. Most of the states that have early and dramatic action have been democratically governed states: New York, California, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Illinois. This is the data from Texas. Texas has a Republican governor and is about to reopen with a soft opening, just maybe today or in the next couple of days. I forget which. And these are their new cases. You know, their daily new cases appear to still be increasing, or at least have not decreased, and their daily fatalities are high. So the Republican politicians are following Trump's cue, and it's having the effect that they are not doing the kind of closing down that that other states, that some Republicans and essentially all Democratic states have been doing. So how does all this affect the election? One thing to be said is that because there are no you can't have crowds, there are no normal election events. The candidates are not traveling. Joe Biden is locked up in his house. He's doing a podcast. The media is dominated by the coronavirus news rather than campaign news, and especially by Trump's press conferences. But those do not appear to be helping President Trump, his performance at the news conferences. So here's some data on how this is affecting public opinion. The first set of data is saying that most people have already made up their mind. 20 or 30% of people are saying it would be a factor in their election. Then in the bottom line, it's who would you rather have handling the coronavirus pandemic? Joe Biden is ahead of Trump by 56 to 40. That's a larger difference than the usual preference between the current electoral preference or general approval of Biden in relation to Trump. So it gives evidence that Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic is not helping, is hurting him somewhat more than other matters. This is another story that is underlining the same thing. The Republican memo, Senate campaign memo, was just discovered, in which the campaign leadership is telling Republican candidates, don't try to defend Trump, don't bring that up. They weren't saying to criticize Trump, but don't affirmatively defend Trump on coronavirus. They don't think that that's persuasive. They want the candidates, to just talk about China and to blame China. The Trump campaign and Trump himself was furious when they learned that the Senate Republicans are not going to be defending him on the coronavirus. And then this is a news flash from Fox News from just yesterday, I think, which is really, really bad news on the economy, which is likely to have an adverse effect on President Trump, quite substantial. Nevertheless, if we look at Trump's overall popularity, this is the best overall graph of his presidency, of his popularity over the whole course of his presidency. The red or the orange line on the top is the number of people who say they disapprove. The green line on the bottom is the number who say they approve of him. The striking thing about this, for those of you who haven't looked at data like this before, is that there is very, very little change at any point. These fluctuations are small by historical standpoints. Near the very end, you see that there was a period where his approval shot up and disapproval shot down. That was the first days of the efforts to of the coronavirus press conferences and his public statements on it, and people's awareness that there was a crisis. There tends to be a rally toward the president in a crisis, and that seems to be that. And since then, he has been trending downward. But I think the most important thing the most obvious thing from this is that nothing that has happened has dramatically reduced his overall approval ratings at this point. These are recent data on the election polls, and the most recent are at the top. So it shows that Donald Trump is supported by 41% compared to 49% by Joe Biden, and there hasn't been a huge amount of change. It's maybe tightened up a little bit from some earlier periods. Election polls do tend to tighten up a bit as the election grows closer. What this would say is that Biden has a substantial lead in the polls. By historical standards, it's not a huge lead. However, this is a chart that is showing something interesting about the size of the lead. The from top to bottom is older elections going all the way back to the 1870s to the most recent elections. The dots where there's a red dot and it's to the right of the horizontal of the vertical line are cases where the Republican candidate won and showing how much they won by. And on the left is Democrats. And what you see is that even down to the 1960s and 1970s and into the 1980s, there were relatively large swings from one election to the next. And if that were the case, then if we're expecting that to be the case now, then Biden's lead might look relatively small by historical standards. However, the most recent elections have had smaller movements, and so the last five elections there are all with the winner having a margin of under 10%. That means less than 55 to 45. The margin that Biden has now in the polls is actually pretty large by the standards of recent elections. And this is another chart that's really quite interesting. I have to explain it a little bit. This is telling you how accurate the polls are at each date, going back to 200 days before the election. So each of these boxes is one election, and the line is showing how much. If the line is in blue, it's saying that the polls at that date were overestimating the Democratic support, and by how much compared with the actual outcome of the election. And when it's in red, it's showing that the polls were overestimating the Republican vote at that date, at that time before the election. And so if you scoot down now to 2004, 2008, 2012, and 2016, what it turns out, what you can see is that polls from an early point, like now, are much more accurate than they had been even as recently as, say, 1996 or 2000. So if you consider the size of the swings that we've seen in recent times and the accuracy of early polls that we've seen in recent times, Biden's lead actually in these polls is very sizable, if not intimidating. Now, another factor is the Electoral College. This is a chart of, you probably all know that President Trump lost the Electoral College vote by a couple of million, almost roughly 2% actually, in 2016 to Hillary Clinton, but he won because of an advantage in the Electoral College. what we have here is a list of some of the states where the election turned out to be fairly close, and the margin, in the second column is the number of electoral votes that Trump won from those states. The third column is the number of electoral votes that Clinton won from those states. And what you see is that there is this, if you look at the Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, which are the states that Trump won that were the closest, he won those states by tiny numbers of votes. If you then look down below those, you'll see that, and Michigan also, that Hillary Clinton did not win significant numbers of states by such tiny numbers of votes. And this was basically saying that Trump had good luck in the Electoral College, just putting the votes exactly where he needed them. This is an analysis of what the Electoral College is likely to be like on average, given where people are living, given where Republicans live and where Democrats live. Scholars have done a bunch of simulations of different elections to find out whether it's likely that say that the Republican Party might win, even if they had an equal vote share. And what this shows is if you look at the horizontal line that comes down to 0.5, 0.5 means a tie in the popular vote, and if you trace that line up, that looks like there's like a 60% chance of, or maybe 65% chance of the Republicans winning if there were a tie in the election. However, if you go down to the Republicans winning 47%, there's almost no chance that they're winning. In other words, what this is saying is that the Republicans could win in the Electoral College without winning the popular vote, but they have to almost win the popular vote. At this point, Joe Biden's lead is significantly larger than that. I'm going to skip a couple of things here. Just stay on this for now. The final thing that I want to mention just briefly is the difficulty that one can expect even conducting the election. Some of you will have watched or seen news about the election in Wisconsin, this is a primary election plus a regular election for state Supreme Court justice. The Democratic governor tried to postpone the election, and the Republican legislature barred them from doing it, and courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, upheld the legislature's positions. So they had this election in Wisconsin that was quite a scandal in that only a handful of polling places were open in Milwaukee because they had difficulty getting polling workers to show up. The result, however, with the Democratic governor tried to extend the deadlines for mail-in votes to substitute for that, to allow people to skip that election, and the Republicans blocked that as well. So they held the election against the Democrats' wishes, but the Democrats won, and won it actually quite handily, an unexpected victory in that Senate, in that state Supreme Court election. And now there's reporting saying that at least 40 people have contracted coronavirus because of voting in that election or working in the polls. I think that one of the major issues that is occurring now is what happens in November if there are still important problems of the pandemic around. Democrats have been pushing legislation to mandate that there would be mail-in voting nationally. Republicans have resisted that and appear inclined to block it. States could adopt that on their own, and some of them probably will. The federal government could impose it, but the Republicans will apparently block that. I should add that the Republicans in the Senate have also blocked legislation to try to bolster the electoral systems of the states against the possibility of Russian interference, which still remains a real possibility. So how the election will occur, how it will be managed is somewhat problematic at this point. There will probably be some states that move wholly to mail-in voting, and others, there could be some states where there are situations like Wisconsin. How that will work out is unknown. Now, an important aspect of this is I don't know whether Republicans are calculating this very well. Here is a relatively recent poll just on party identification during the Trump period. Younger people have turned against Trump and the Republicans rather substantially during this period. And just in that top group of data, what you see is that younger people are more pro-democratic by substantial amounts, and older people are evenly balanced at this point. I think it's very likely that if the election is conducted in some places under conditions that are problematic about the pandemic, older people may not show because they are clearly the ones who are more at risk for the virus. So that's where we're at with respect to the election. I think it appears that the Trump campaign is in very deep trouble, and they are aware of that. And that'll be all. I can move to taking questions.
Thank you, Paul. Certainly the questions are coming in, so I'll move over to our question and answer.
Okay, I just got that. Let's see, I'm just getting this open, I think. Oh.
So very soon you should see questions. Can you see the questions?
I see. I have Slido open. Should I have Slido open, or should I have?
No, you can stay on the same screen, and I'm going to show this question should show on the screen.
Okay.
And
I had left the Zoom screen to look at my PowerPoint, and
so on that same screen as your PowerPoint, the questions should come up.
No,
are you seeing them, Paul?
I had two screens that showed PowerPoint. Let me just see if I have which one I have here.
You should be looking for a very blue screen.
Yeah, okay, I have that.
Oh, super.
Okay.
So yeah, the questions have been coming in, Paul, since you started your lecture, and
okay, so it says the first one is the individual states are arguing about personal protective equipment supplies and easing restrictions in a disjointed manner. Is this pandemic related or something deeper? The states, there are two different things here. One is the arguing about the personal protective equipment supplies. They are in competition with each other and in conflict, to some degree, conflict with each other over obtaining the supplies because of the very unusual market situation there. That is, there's a severe shortage of something that the states are trying to acquire. And that is not a normal circumstance in economic markets. The federal government, almost everybody who analyzes this believes that the federal government should have taken over the supplies of those matters and provided it to the states. As for the disjointed manner of easing restrictions, imposing restrictions and easing them, that is a normal matter. That is, the states in the United States, much like Canadian provinces, have a great deal of discretion in how they operate. And so it's not terribly surprising that they deal with this differently. It is surprising, I think, that many of the Republican states have sort of bought into trying to make Trump look good in the short term to such an extent that they have taken actions that seem predictably to be leading in those very states very soon to bad results, unless I'm misunderstanding something. So that's kind of the pathology of the Trump administration. People acting out of fear of Trump, who would not have done the same thing under other circumstances.
Great. Thank you. So the next question, Paul, do you see President Trump given less time to speak at press briefings to prevent comments that might damage his popularity?
Yeah, that's something that is getting discussed in the White House probably every day. It's clear that this is a matter where the president's own preferences tend to dominate. His advisors have concluded that the briefings and his performances at the briefings, particularly given the questions that he gets asked, have not been helpful to him. He's being criticized for stupendous amounts of lying, which is easily provable, and the media comments on it. He blows up he spends his time blowing up at journalists or making irrelevant attacks on Hillary Clinton or the FBI. And so his advisors would like him to stop. And he briefly did opt out over the weekend, but it's not at all clear that he can discipline himself or will discipline himself to not be there. So I'd say that he's probably going to keep on speaking.
Thank you. The next question, Paul, how will debate topics differentiate as the pandemic's permanent effects grow each day?
Debate, I'm guessing that this means topics in the general presidential campaign and the presidential debates. I think it could mean informal debates that between the candidates. I think it's fairly likely that Trump will not agree to participate in debates against Joe Biden. It's voluntary on his part. And I think there's evidence of awareness in the White House of his increased difficulty with facility with facts and with language and the like, that he would quite possibly bow out of debating. But either in those debates or just in the media debate and the campaign advertising, I think that the growth of the effects of the pandemic do indeed make it harder and harder and predictably on Trump and his campaign. The economic effects are going to be much more visible and important to people quite soon. It's hard to see how the media environment and the issue environment won't become severely difficult for him over coming months. Excuse me.
Thank you. So Paul, we heard that Trump was warned about the virus as early as January. Have you any idea if the Trudeau government was also aware and briefed this early?
You know, that's an interesting matter. I would assume that they were. They would have contacts directly. In the first place, the American government was getting information in a lot of ways, including directly from China. The Trudeau government. Something important about the Trudeau government's response is that the Canadian government is less centralized than the American government is in some matters like this. I think that quite possibly some, the Trudeau government can be criticized for not catching on and making more of the pandemic earlier than the administration also. But at least most of the provinces kind of got on board before the United States did, and most of the states, and with British Columbia being the shining example of that.
Yeah, thank you. So this question, aren't the Dems also far from mainstream with the AOC and the squad and insiders like Linda Sarsour and Cornel West?
Those people who you mentioned are far from the mainstream. When I mentioned the developing extremism of the Republican Party, I didn't give you any data, but I'll mention that. I'll mention that now. In the United States, unlike parliamentary systems, individual members of Congress have discretion over their votes on bills, and as a result of that, political scientists are able to measure the ideological positions of members of Congress on the basis of their votes on bills and get individual scores. And the data are really extremely clear that the Democratic Party since the 1970s has been relatively constant. It has moved slightly to the left, but the Republican Party, and especially in the House, has moved much farther to the right. And the comments by Mann and Ornstein that I referred to earlier aren't just about votes on particular policies. It's also the party strategy in negotiations and the like. I think they were writing at about the time that the Republicans threatened to bring down or defeat the debt limitation extension, which would have in 2011, which would have caused the United States to default on its debt at tremendous cost to the world economy. The Democrats have, I think, a political problem of the increased activism and aggressiveness of the left wing of the party. That would be a difficulty, a considerable threat to their chances of winning the election. The thing that's favorable from that standpoint for them is that Joe Biden has not been associated with that group. He's viewed as a more moderate candidate for good reasons. And it's really the presidential candidate more than a few peripheral figures that determines the way people think of the party.
Thank you. So Paul, how will President Trump's performance during this pandemic affect his performance in the debate for the election? How does it affect his chances to win?
This looks like it may have been written kind of early because I spent some time on that. I think the evidence is that his performance is likely to hurt his chances quite dramatically.
Sure.
Same with the next one. I'm guessing that those were earlier.
Yeah, this is a good question also. Will Biden's lack of vocalization during the pandemic in terms of what he would do to address things hurt his chances come election time?
Well, he's not this is a very interesting question. He certainly is not getting the national media attention that he would normally have gotten. He is vocalizing. That is, he has a podcast and he is tweeting. And there is advertising that is being run primarily in the states that are likely to be close battleground states in the election. One of the things that's very peculiar about watching American elections is that if you watch watch television in the United States, And if you do not live in one of the 15 or so states where the election tends to be close, you don't see much evidence that the election is going on, because the advertising is directed to the states that are going to be close. So if you were living in Michigan right now, you'd be hearing a lot of Biden's views about Trump's handling of the pandemic from advertising by Biden.
And this is in relation to your slide about.
Yeah, I think that's this is something that I think is really quite striking. I think the aspect of the Trump presidency that has been most surprising for analysts of politics has been how steady his support has been from Republicans, despite what even many Republican commentators, they're no longer influential with Republican audiences, but many former Republican commentators would regard as a just enormous string of scandals and policy failures. Nevertheless, his approval rating has been has held in the low 40s from very shortly after his presidency, after his inauguration, to the present time. There has never been a steadier kind of level of support. And it's a new phenomenon in American politics. It seems to be reflecting that people are more partisan than they were before, and that people who associate themselves with a party are just more unwilling to take negative information, take it on board and react to it, rather than reject it. So this is this is one of the big surprising phenomena, how firm the support of ordinary Republicans has been for President Trump, despite the enormous difficulties of his record.
And Paul, if I could add to that, you showed a slide where the accuracy rates have improved in more recent elections. Can you speak to why those accuracy rates?
Yes, I think actually, I think I probably ran over two of those slides too quickly. I showed you one that showed that the margins, the change in margins from one election to another are getting smaller. The swing is smaller, and then polls, newer polls are polls in more recent years are more accurate. I think those are both due to the same thing, which is that voters are more partisan. They're more locked in to a party, and therefore the vote is not going to swing very far. There's a modest number of people who are weak partisans, and a modest number of people who consider themselves independent, and they swing back and forth. Trump basically has been losing the vast majority of the independent vote, and it would be hard to see what would, given his record and the news is likely to be forthcoming, there's no reason to see that changing.
Okay, thank you. So Paul, if Canada, hopefully when Canada gets things under control with the virus, but the US remains behind, how will this affect us in Canada?
You know, this is a major issue that I know about international cooperation and coordination. I just noticed that you know, New Zealand has prevented any substantial outbreak of coronavirus, and in recent days has had essentially no cases. I think none in some recent days. And the difficulty is there are other countries where the pandemic may be circulating for ages, you know, from now, months or years. And all of those countries that manage to get it under control have no immunity unless and until a vaccine develops. So I don't think the countries have faced up to this yet, but there are going to be, it would appear, very serious difficulties with trade and travel and tourism between any pair of countries that have, where one of them managed to control things quite well, and others are operating with the virus out of control for many months. And this difficulty will not go away unless and until a vaccine is developed that enables everybody to be protected.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Paul, can you speculate on the impact the pandemic disrupting the election or of a move to delay the election?
Yeah, I was wondering whether to comment on that. The darkest view to take of President Trump and the Republicans would be to say that there is a significant danger that they would seize on the problems of the pandemic as an excuse for delaying the election, or claiming after the election that it had that its results were invalid and refusing to accept them. Now, in the context of American politics over the years, that there has never been any episode remotely like that kind of challenge to regular electoral processes. But Trump, on a daily basis, violates major norms of the political system and disputes the legitimacy of established features of the system in really quite extreme ways. He calls for throwing out members of the FBI in jail, claims that the election will be a fraud. He actually already has worried about that kind of thing. And then the real difficulty is to what extent other Republicans are willing to follow along with that. If you had the president and a majority of the Republican majority in the Senate saying that the election was invalid, you'd have a real mess on your hands. It could actually get to the point where what really determined the outcome was who the military leaders decided to obey, whether they ushered President Trump out of the White House because he had lost the election, or they protected him because he was the commander-in-chief and he was telling them to do it, and he was canceling the election results. This is, I think, a relatively low probability, extraordinarily severe disaster. I think it's a very low probability, but it's not out of the question in the manner that one would have thought it had been at any previous time in American politics.
Yeah, worrying thoughts indeed. Would Trump's rhetoric against China and the World Health Organization with COVID-19 have any impact on his re-election? Obviously, World Health Organization has also been under scrutiny.
I would say that that rhetoric is not terribly likely to be effective. It may be the most effective thing that Trump and the Republicans will have to say, and they can't campaign on just saying, yes, the Democrats are right, we screwed it up terribly and we've caused millions of serious illnesses and tens of thousands of deaths. So they have to have an argument. And I think this is probably their best argument. But it doesn't work very well, because the evidence is overwhelming that the United States had ample warning and certainly had the fundamental resources and capacity to protect itself against the virus. And I think it will be quite easy to demonstrate that the United States will have done the worst job of any developed country in the world on this. So that will be those will be his arguments, but I don't think they will be very effective.
Mm. How do you think the Democratic debates may have gone differently if the pandemic had been at the forefront before candidates started dropping out?
That's an interesting question. This is the first time I've thought of this, so this will be kind of off the top of my head. I think that awareness of a crisis, which is what this would be, would have kind of subdued the fervor for ideologically driven reforms and candidacies, and put a bigger premium on perceptions of crisis management skills and experience and the like. So I think that the pandemic would have worked to Joe Biden's advantage among the candidates who were prominent in the later stages because of his apparent steadiness and especially his experience as vice president.
So your thoughts on, do you think it's setting a bad precedent when the president and the VP refuse to wear a mask in public?
Well, I wouldn't expect the president to wear a mask while he's standing at a podium speaking to the public. The episode that is received, I think, justifiably received very severe criticism was the vice president not wearing a mask while visiting coronavirus patients, among others, at the Mayo Clinic Hospital, and that certainly set a bad example. This reminds me of something that I passed over. I think I skipped commenting on it entirely. I had planned to make some remarks about it, and that is that in addition to the president's position affecting the behavior of Republican governors, there is evidence that it has affected the behavior with respect to the coronavirus situation of Republican ordinary citizens. That is, in polls, the people who identify as Democrats express more concern about the virus, more fear about suffering illness or family members suffering illness, and the harm from the economy than Republicans do. As Republicans have kind of bought into the notion of that defending the president requires understating the harm from the coronavirus. There's some ambiguity about how much this is actually affecting Democrats and Republicans' personal responses. That is, things like hand washing and staying away from other people and staying away from crowds. Clearly, some fans of the president are holding rallies and very clearly ignoring social distancing at these rallies. But the polls that ask people about, are you washing your hands more? Or are you keeping away from other people? Show small differences, with Democrats more concerned, Republicans more concerned. But this is likely to have some effect of causing Republicans to become more ill.
After this impact of COVID to the US economy, is Biden ready with a stronger economic revival plan if he gets elected?
I don't know whether anybody has very well organized thoughts on what economic policy will be in January of 2021, which is when Biden would actually become president. In the short term, I mean, in the near term, the question is to what extent Republicans in the Senate and President Trump will reach agreements with Democrats in the House to adopt revival plans for the current period. They have done quite a bit already. Certainly have spent a lot of money already. They've also had severe disagreements that have interfered with the adoption of stimuli, and have also potentially interfered with the effectiveness of it. The Republicans, especially President Trump, have resisted establishing auditing arrangements to ensure that the money is spent in an honest way and gets to the people who need it, rather than being kind of grabbed by large corporations. The initial reviews are that the administration of the program is going rather poorly, with very large amounts of waste and money being dispersed carelessly, largely to very wealthy institutions. So the issue about the revival for the next almost a year is really about negotiations between the Democratic House and the Republicans, and so far they've had some success. They could have done better.
Do you have any thoughts, Paul, on if you think Canada will open things back up before or after? Oh, bless you. If Canada will open back up before or after the US, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that it's really hard to see what's going to happen. I think it's most likely that the states that are opening now, don't, like Texas and Iowa and Nebraska under Republican leadership, that still have very active outbreaks, will end up losing control of the spread of the virus within the states fairly dramatically within a few weeks or a month, and then they will have to kind of start over again at getting things under control, close things down, and the like. So I think that the Americans' premature opening and failure to even close in some places where the virus is kind of still just arriving is likely to mean that there will be a very active epidemic, very active spread going on in the United States well after it has been brought under control in Canada. And so Canada should be able to open things up before the United States does. And Canada will have difficulties deciding how many Americans or under what circumstances to allow across the borders.
Right. Right. How might the debates be different in terms of crowds, length of time, social distancing, and the location due to precautions because of the pandemic?
So this is, again, I think, about televised presidential debates, which if they would occur basically in September and October. And if the virus is still spreading or hasn't been brought under control by then in the United States, I think those debates would occur on television without audiences, or possibly with audiences, small audiences seated pretty far apart. It wouldn't affect the length of time of the debates if they had it. But again, I don't think it's very likely that Trump will agree to debate. And again, I think I have that thought partly because of all of the difficult material he'd have to answer to facing directly, the charges about the epidemic and so forth, but also because I think there is awareness among him, his advisors, and him that that he has slowed down and wouldn't perform very well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'm just curious, conscious of time. It's 2:08, Paul. We've got a couple of more questions.
Let's just do these last two.
Yeah, thank you for, and I know you agreed to stay over, so thank you so much for that. So Trump thoughtlessly mused in public about the effect of disinfectant, but is it fair to misleadingly report he recommended it?
Yeah, he didn't recommend it. That is, the premise of this question is correct. What he did was recommend or urge or ask, his top scientists to see to it that researchers look into those effects. This is unlike his actual recommendations on this hydroxychloroquine, where he did recommend to people that they actually take it. So I think the Democrats and much of the media are indeed overstating and misleadingly stating that he recommended taking this disinfectant. I think it would be it would have been better to be more precise. What he did was it was still spectacularly uninformed and ignorant advice, but the advice was that researchers should study it, which is certainly less reckless. It's not, or arguably not even reckless, although I think a president should take into account that people will take his suggestions for more than he literally says. There was a story that indicated that there were about 30 additional poisonings from household disinfectants in the New York area the day after he made those comments. So even though he didn't recommend it, what he did say was uninformed and irresponsible.
Mm-hmm. And I think certainly the companies were expecting that, and hence they also came out very quickly to urge people not to participate in that behavior. There was a second question about that. I hope that answers for that participant. And the final question that I have here, Paul, is when do you predict the states will stop the isolation orders? And when do you predict Canada might do the same? I think we already answered that.
Yeah, I think so.
And it was asked in a different way. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
So, so yes, that's actually all our questions today. So I'm just going to move, keep a hold of the screen and go back to my own. Sorry. Yes, so before I move on into the important thank yous, I'd just like to inform our participants of our upcoming May lectures. And indeed, our participants' continuing presence, their contributions and enthusiasm has actually heartened us to continue with this popular series. And so on the screen now, you'll see a quick overview of what we have. And just very quickly, May the 7th, we will have science mixed with history as we compare and contrast the 14th century bubonic plague.
You cannot view your PowerPoint.
Oh. Thank you. Thank you. My apologies for that. Thank you, Dan. Dan, can you see this now?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. So my apologies for that. Just again, very quickly, this is our continuing series from May. We have 6 upcoming lectures. The first on May 7th will be a mixture of science with history as we compare and contrast the 14th century bubonic plague and today's COVID-19. On May 12th, gain some insight into the world of vaccines. May 14th, we will examine how the government is applying the income tax system in these tough economic times. On May 19th, we will explore integrative health systems and their relevance today. May 21st, How will COVID-19 affect the UN's Sustainable Development Agenda? Closing on May 26th with a reveal of coronavirus gender data and what our policy makers could do with this information. Oh. And so just to let people know that they can find out more about the lectures on our 1 hour website, the address here, exl.ubc.ca/1 hour, or they can call us at 604-822-1444. Again, today's recording will be on our YouTube channel very soon. And so that just leaves me to thank you, Paul, for a very informative lecture today, very interesting. Thank you so much for being generously sharing your perspective and your very valuable time with us again.
Thank you, it was fun, and the questions were interesting and useful, so I appreciate being invited.
Thank you. And again, thank you, as always, to our participants for being here, sharing your Thursday with us, and always asking your carefully considered questions. Take care, everybody. Stay safe and see you soon.